Okay, so part 3 of this is we're going to start talking about prejudice and discrimination a little bit more. And we had talked that there are different levels of this. Think about what inequality has looked like over the course of history. And I think that that's something that you probably have certain images that sort of stick in your mind. Think back to Elizabeth Eckford being followed by an angry mob when she was making her way to an integrated high school in Little Rock. There's probably images sort of stuck in your mind of men or women drinking from segregated water fountains. Maybe it's Rosa Parks sitting on a bus in 1956 in Birmingham, Alabama, sort of refusing to give up her seat to a white passenger. Think about these things. I mean, the civil rights movement was such a stark conversation piece when it comes to race. But what's interesting is we can still see some inequality that exists today. Inequalities experienced by minority groups are common across the globe. And so I want to begin to decipher the differences that can occur. There are 2 types, one of which is discrimination. Discrimination is the denial of equal treatment to individuals based on their group membership. So it can occur at an individual level or societal level, right? When it gets to that societal level, that means we've outgrown that structure of a society. Here's a systematic discrimination figure, and this is figure 9.2 when we're talking about buying a house. We can see that it's shifted into the banking system, and we can begin to see that when we look at the rates of high interest rates nationwide, we can see that it varies based upon individuals' race. When we look at some of these things, you're like, well, it's hard to begin to fathom that even in today's society that we're still seeing these discrimination at an institutional level, but it does occur. The same goes for healthcare related areas. Here's infant deaths, maternal deaths, and life expectancy. You can see that African Americans versus whites have some stark differences in their rates. And why is that? Is that due to access to resources? Is that due to being denied services or other reasons? Well, that's why we're asking these questions. I also want us to look at things in reference to prejudice. Prejudice is an unsupported generalization about a category of people, and there are various different patterns of prejudice that can begin to occur. Robert K. Merton, we had talked about him before, began to argue that prejudice and discrimination are related. They don't necessarily always go hand in hand, but Merton believed that people could combine discrimination and prejudice in 4 ways. You do not need to know those 4 ways. They do exist. So down the road, if you ever take a future sociology class, that is something that conversation will probably be had. In this particular case, I want you guys to understand that there's something called a stereotype, which we had talked about before, where you're seeing some type of oversimplified, exaggerated, or unfavorable generalization about a particular group. And we had talked about that. Who's better at sports, maybe driving, smarter. There's these little stereotypes that exist within our society. But what can happen is that it can lead into racism, which is the belief that one's own race is superior than another's. I do want us to become familiar with that there are certain theories of prejudice and how these explanations can vary. The first is that there's a sociological explanation. Prejudices are embedded within social norms. That is what we believe as sociologists, is that these prejudice that exists within our society are so ingrained into our day-to-day interactions that a lot of times you don't even notice it. On the flip side, when it comes to psychological explanation, we understand that prejudiced people tend to have an authoritarian personality type. So what does that mean? Think back to some of those figures that we've seen with these really strong images. Hitler, Mussolini, even members of the KKK, right? These are all individuals where they believe that there are high-rank individuals, there's an intolerance, conformity, even a sense that people have to respect certain types of authority, and they want that submissiveness to superiors in that sense. And so studies have shown that there isn't necessarily one particular personality type that can attach to that, but more so with the concept that if somebody is less educated, they tend to have more prejudices just because they're unaware of that. So, of course, this is something that researchers want to continue to study. Not only that, psychologists also believe that prejudice may be the result of frustration and anger, as well as something called scapegoating. This is where an individual or group unfairly blames for someone else's troubles, right? We've heard that term scapegoating before. This is something that's very common in the concept of prejudice because, that particular group denied me access because I couldn't do this or that type of mentality, even though that person had nothing to do with the controversy at hand. And then, of course, we have economic explanations. Prejudice can arise out of competition for resources, which we know of when we talk about the conflict theory, as well as we know that dominant groups may encourage competition between minority groups in order to maintain that dominant status in a sense. Of course, there are three main sociological perspectives. The first one, of course, is the functionalist perspective. We know that prejudice is functional. It's sort of shaped by the social environment that we live in. There were two particular psychologists, Mustafa and Sheriff, who began to examine a boys' summer camp where the friends were assigned to different cabins, and then each of those cabins then began to compete in sports. We began to see that there were in-groups that were formed. Lifelong friends began to taunt one another, calling them crybaby, sissy, that type of thing. We saw that in the video you guys saw earlier from the 60s, where the kids were broken up into blue eyes and brown-eyed kids, and how best friends were all of a sudden mortal enemies in a sense because of that, right? It's that sense of that when we have prejudice, there is some type of function because it creates that in-group solidarity. And in a sense, that dysfunction that can then arise can destroy those human relationships also. The conflict theory, in a sense, is another concept I want you guys to become familiar with. Here we're talking about, and remember, we're talking about a constant conflict. So understand there is a division of workers a lot of times between racial and ethnic and even gender lines. That's called the split labor market. This split begins to be exploited by owners to sort of weaken that bargaining power of workers. And so you'll start to see that today's exploitation of these divisions is much more subtle. Whites are definitely more aware that there are other racial and ethnic groups ready to take their jobs. And I think that there's a lot of the controversy when people begin to talk about other groups, maybe in other countries, that are creating products in that same sense. So there's underlying prejudice that can begin to occur in that sense as a result of a competition of scarce resources, in a sense. And we also know that there's a reserve labor force. The split market is one way that the owners begin to divide that, the workers, so that they can take in the higher wages and, necessarily don't have to offer better working conditions. Another tactic, of course, is called the reserve labor force. This is another term for the unemployed. To begin to expand production during economic booms, companies hire people who don't necessarily have jobs. And so when the economy contracts, we begin to see that those layoffs begin to occur with those unneeded workers. And finally, I want to talk a little bit about symbolic interactionist. This is fairly simple in the sense that we know symbolic interactionists stress the concept of labels and how those labels begin to affect people. Labels create something called a selective perception. Here, this is when we begin to see that they lead into how people react to other people, right? It creates certain features of an object or situation, but remains blind to others, in a sense. So think about that. We know that there are some racially charged words, stereotypical words that are used. And those words hold a lot of power and a lot of negative emotions as a result of that. The book sort of highlights some of those words in that sense because they are used to belittle other groups. And so those words sometimes overpower us with other emotions rather than blocking out the rational thought about the people who that's referring to. So those are very powerful things just with that concept of a label. If you use a derogatory racial word, you know that that's carrying a negative context within it. So sometimes those stereotypes not only justify prejudice and discrimination, but they also produce behaviors that are depicted within that stereotype. So we begin to see that as well, just so you guys have a little bit more background in reference to it.